It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr. Many of you all know Commissioner Carr. He's been a long-time leader in our world at the FCC, having formerly served as the FCC's General Counsel and as Chief Advisor for wireless issues for then Commissioner Pai. These days, he's increasingly on the road, having crisscrossed rural America to learn about broadband deployment challenges and the opportunities created by new capabilities like telehealth. Commissioner Carr has also been the driving force behind some of the most recent and most important efforts to modernize our wireless infrastructure siting policies. We're very excited that he's taken time to talk with us about these efforts and how they are key to our 5G deployment and our world leadership in wireless. So please join me in welcoming Commissioner Carr.
All right. Thank you, Scott, for the kind introduction. Appreciate it. It's great to be back with you at Mobile World Congress Americas. This is truly an exciting time for the country. We are in the cusp of a major upgrade in wireless service with 5G. One that will mean better, faster, and more competitive broadband, to be sure, but one that will also serve as the catalyst for economic growth, new kinds of jobs, a 21st century education for our kids, and access to high-quality, affordable health care. Now, standing here today, we can't predict all of the inventions that will be built on America's 5G platform. After all, who could have imagined the technology we have today as a result of 4G? A decade ago, catching a ride across town involved a phone call, waiting 20 minutes for a cab to arrive, and paying rates that were inaccessible to most people. Today we have Lyft, Uber, Via, or my new favorite way to get to work, electric scooters from Bird, Lime, or Jump. Now, the ribbing that I get from FCC security guards as I roll down 12th Street towards the office almost is enough to offset the convenience, but it's close. Now, a decade ago, seeing a doctor in a pinch meant pleading with an office manager or waiting for hours in an ER. Today, a click of an app lets you live stream a specialist on your smartphone at a fraction of the cost of an in-person visit. A decade ago, meeting your future husband or wife required, and I know this is going to sound very 1950s to the millennials in the crowd, so stay with me. It required mustering the courage to walk up to them in person and wait for it, engage in a conversation in which you asked him or her out. Today, my staff tells me a potential loved one can be just a swipe away. Now, I should pause at this point. So in going over this portion of the speech with my staff, I learned a lot about the new online dating scene, and I learned some disturbing information. One thing I learned, apparently today a date means just going out for drinks. When I was going through the process of meeting now Miss Carr, my wife, a date was something entirely different. And there were rules about this. So a date back then had 3 elements. First could be a meal. Second, there had to be some sort of change in venue, maybe dessert somewhere else. And third, some sort of activity. You could go for a walk on the mall in DC, go for the observatory here in LA, and then fourth, and there wasn't a fourth really. Should probably cut it off at that point. Back to the speech. American companies led the way in developing these 4G innovations, such as they are. But it's not by chance or luck that the United States is the world's tech and innovation hub. We have the strongest wireless economy in the world because we won the race to 4G. No country had faster 4G deployment and more intensive investment than we did. Winning the race to 4G added $100 billion to our GDP. It led to $125 billion in revenue for U.S. companies that could have otherwise gone elsewhere. And it grew wireless jobs in the U.S. by 84%. That history should remind policymakers at all levels of government exactly what is at stake as we compete to be first in 5G. It's about our economic leadership for the next decade. And the race has started. There's already good news to report for communities across the country. 2 providers have announced that 5G service will go live this year in about a dozen cities, including right here in LA. The private sector, not the government, is planning to invest more than $250 billion to densify their networks with new small cells, which are the building blocks of 5G. That represents a massive investment in America's infrastructure and jobs without a penny in new taxes. But we also can't understate the challenge ahead. Since 2015, China has built 350,000 cell sites as part of its plan to densify networks for 5G. Less than 30,000 were built in the U.S. over that same period of time. There's no doubt that spectrum is key to 5G, and the U.S. is moving forward aggressively on that front. But spectrum alone is not going to close that gap. We have to be honest about this. We have to recognize and have the courage to address this real infrastructure challenge. To upgrade our networks, to win this race to 5G, we need to upgrade our rules. Until recently, our approach to infrastructure assumed that every new cell site was a large 200-foot tower. That meant long and costly reviews, and that makes no sense when 80% of all new deployments are going to be small cells. Our antiquated regulatory approach was the bottleneck preventing the U.S. from getting 5G ready. That's why I'm glad Chairman Pai asked me to lead the FCC's efforts on infrastructure reform. And there's good news to report on this effort. In March, the FCC updated the federal historic and environmental review procedures that apply to the construction of cell sites to account for this new wave of small cell deployments. With that reform in place, one provider already reports that it's now clearing small cells for construction at roughly 6 times the pace as before. And it's not just federal rules that are now seeing updates. Mayors and local leaders recognize that the fees and approval process that apply to 200-foot towers are not appropriate for the size and scale of small cell deployment. Over the last 2 years, they've reduced the fees they charge for reviewing small cells, and they set sensible timelines for permitting. Those forward-looking policies are already benefiting their communities. I was in Indianapolis last week to meet with local leaders. Since enacting Indiana's siting reform last year, wireless providers have built over 1,000 small cells in more than 30 communities across the Hoosier State. 2 of the country's largest wireless providers have announced Indy as their showcase city for 5G, with next-gen networks going live by the end of this year. Indiana's grassroots leadership has produced these results while respecting the needs of the state's diverse communities. The city of Fishers, right outside of Indy, is a prosperous, growing community. It's a place where people want to move to raise their families. Fishers is positioning itself to be at the leading edge of the tech economy. The mayor, Scott Fadness, spearheaded the creation of the Indiana IoT Lab there earlier this year. Mayor Fadness understands the importance of mobile broadband to Fishers, but he also knows that unsightly small cell deployments are not in anyone's interest. So the mayor negotiated a provision in the state small cell bill to preserve the right of municipalities to conduct reasonable aesthetic reviews. Last week, Mayor Fadness showed me the results. Dozens of new small cells deployed on streetlights to minimize their visual impact. Affordable mobile broadband deployed unobtrusively. That's a win-win for the people of Fishers. And other leaders around the country are picking up the mantle of reform. In Texas, Governor Abbott told me about his state's small cell legislation. Since enacting their bill, major 5G investments have been announced in Austin, Dallas, Houston, and Waco. Tonight, I'll head to Arizona, where I'll meet with Governor Ducey and a mayor from a community just outside Phoenix. Arizona's small cell legislation is spurring high-tech investment, the creation of a smart region, and a partnership with Arizona State University to prepare students for next-gen careers. Despite all that progress, there are still many communities, especially in rural America, that feel that they may be left behind. They want to see their residents get a fair shot at this new wave of economic opportunity that 5G can unleash. They worry that the billions of dollars of investment needed to deploy next-gen networks will be consumed by high fees and long delays in big, must-serve cities. Their elected leaders have called on the FCC to act because they are concerned that without federal action, they may not see 4G, let alone 5G service. As an industry that seeks to provide coast-to-coast service, as policymakers charged by Congress with helping to implement nationwide networks, it's imperative that we hear those voices. So I'd like to read from a few of the many letters I've received over the last few months. Dwayne Ankney is a retired coal miner from Montana with a handlebar mustache that would be the envy of nearly any hipster today. But more relevantly, he's a member of the Montana State Legislature, and he's chair of the Senate's Telecom Committee. He wrote me, "Where I see the problem is that most of the investment capital is spent in large urban areas. This is primarily due to the high regulatory cost and the cost recovery that can be made in those areas. This leaves rural areas out." Mary Weisenon, an Iowa commissioner, writes, "With 99 counties in Iowa, we understand the need to streamline the network build-out process so it's not just big cities that get 5G, but also our small towns. If companies are tied up with delays and high fees, it's going to take that much longer for each and every Iowan to see next-generation connectivity." Ashton Hayward, the mayor of Pensacola, Florida, "Excessive and arbitrary fees result in nothing more than telecom providers being required to spend limited investment dollars on fees as opposed to spending those limited resources on the type of high-speed infrastructure that is so important to our community." The entire board of commissioners from a rural area in Michigan writes, "Smaller communities, such as those located in St. Clair County, would benefit by having the FCC reduce the costly and unnecessary fees that some larger communities place on small cells as a condition of deployment. These fees, wholly disproportionate to any cost, put communities like ours at an unfair disadvantage. By making small cell deployment less expensive, the FCC will send a clear message that all communities, regardless of size, should share in the benefits of this crucial new technology." They're right. When I think about success, when I think about winning this race to 5G, the finish line is not the moment we see next-gen deployments in places like New York or San Francisco. Success can only be achieved when all Americans, no matter where they live, have a fair shot at fast, affordable broadband. We at the FCC have studied the ideas championed by local leaders in 20 states that have now passed small cell bills. We learned how removing unnecessary regulatory barriers to deployment directly impacts investment, jobs, education, families. Based on that grassroots work, I announced last week the next steps in the FCC's efforts to bring more broadband to more Americans. Later this month, the FCC will vote on a proposal designed to support small cell deployment. It contains 4 main ideas. First, it reaffirms local control over wireless infrastructure decisions where it is most appropriate, while setting reasonable baseline so we can promote nationwide 5G deployment. By taking a balanced approach, we show respect for the work state legislatures have done, and we don't disturb nearly any of the provisions in the 20 state-level small cell bills that have already been passed. Second, the proposal affirms that local governments may charge wireless providers for the cost associated with reviewing small cell deployment. There will be no subsidizing of broadband deployment by local governments. Providers should bear the cost of building 5G. At the same time, we know that excessive fees slow down next-gen deployments and consume the scarce capital needed to bring broadband to rural and less affluent communities. So we propose fees that amount to a reasonable approximation of a local government's costs. Third, we tailor the shot clocks that have long governed local review of infrastructure deployment to account for the size and scale of small cell deployment. Consistent with many state laws, we determined that local governments should conclude their approval process within 60 days for small cells being added to existing structures and 90 days when a provider wants to put up a new small cell pole. But we also built in a mechanism to recognize when large numbers of small cell deployments could lead to a legitimate overload of the local permitting process. Fourth, we preserve local governments' reasonable aesthetic reviews. We affirm that federal law doesn't prevent local governments from continuing to apply aesthetic standards so long as they're reasonable, non-discriminatory, and disclosed ahead of time. These are common sense ideas that come from local leaders. By taking these ideas nationwide, we will have a real impact on jobs and access. The proposal is estimated to cut about $2 billion in red tape, stimulate $2.4 billion in additional investment, and create 27,000 jobs. By lowering the cost of deploying small cells, this decision will flip the business case for building 5G in next-gen networks in less affluent communities. According to economists, nearly 2 million more homes will be reached by small cells, and 97% of those will be in rural and suburban communities. Those are big numbers. Those are reforms that can help cement U.S. leadership in technology over the next decade. But discussions like this can sometimes obscure the impact that policy has on everyday Americans. So I'd like to close by telling you about an extraordinary young woman I met who was empowered by mobile broadband. Her name's Tommy. She's the mom to 5 kids. Many people have had an easier path in life. Tommy grew up in public housing in Philly. She dropped out of high school after giving birth to her first kid. For the next 16 years, she made calls for a debt collection agency, which she described as a dead-end job. Tommy knew she could do more with her life. So she enrolled in Philadelphia's Orleans Technical College. It was 4 years of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches often made for me by my kids, she said. Tommy earned a perfect 4.0 GPA. She got a job at the Public Housing Authority, and she just bought her first home. Now she's starting a master's program in mental health so she can give back to her community. None of this, Tommy told me, would have been possible without a mobile broadband connection. She said, broadband is the backbone of a community for finding a job, for education. A mobile hotspot she shared with her neighbors let her finish her homework, which was required to be completed online. A mobile connection enabled her to apply for employment and for admission to school. Now, the grit and determination shown by Tommy is an inspiration. Meeting her a few months back is an experience that stuck with me. And the challenges she faced would only have been more daunting without the opportunity that a mobile broadband connection enabled. We want the life-changing opportunities of broadband for all Americans, no matter where they live. We have a chance to help do that later this month by following the example of local leaders and getting rid of unnecessary barriers to deployment. I look forward to voting on September 26th to put those reforms in place. And I want to assure you, the FCC is committed, not just in words, but in action, to winning this race to 5G. Thanks.